Francesco Ferrero, if I remind just in a few words, the list is the Research and Technology Organization of the Luxembourg government. You have got 4 different departments. And when the pandemic stepped in, you had a specific role, which was to coordinate the supply chain also for the hospitals in Luxembourg and the procurement especially, which clearly was a complete mess. How did you approach this, and what did you learn in terms of how to react to shocks that impact directly the supply chain?
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for this very important question. So you all understand how shocking COVID-19 was, right, on several supply chains, including in the medical sector. All the hospitals in Luxembourg were used to work with a single intermediary, a wholesaler, and this was just gone overnight, and they had to revert to direct supplying from a lot of multiple suppliers. There was a shock in supply, notably because many factories were shut down in China and the Far East. There were problems in transport because many borders were closed and the people couldn't travel. There was a shortage of workers. So it's like overnight you are in a completely different world. And there were even worse than that, there were acts of piracy, even between member states of the European Union. We saw that the trucks transporting personal protective equipment to another country were seized while they were crossing the country.
Well.
Yeah, so this was something really scary. And so all the community of the research in Luxembourg, we pulled up together with the government to try and find a solution. And the first thing that we had in mind was the problem is that we lack the ability to anticipate issues and we lack the visibility along the supply chain. That's a typical problem. Supply chains are very complex. They can be extremely long, up to 7, 8 tires. In the best of cases, you have visibility of the first tire or the second or the third, but almost no one, even the very big corporations, have a full visibility. And if something happens in the 7th tire, then the problem will just go up the supply chain and you will be screwed. Your production will be stopped. And so we said we need to develop something that resembles a control tower for aviation, right? Because it's not by chance aviation is a typical sector where they are well trained to manage crises, right? And they have a motto in aviation, which is when you have a crisis, you need to aviate, so you need to keep flying the plane. You need to navigate, so you need to have a very good look at the situation around you, and you need to communicate. You need to explain to your passengers, to the people, what is happening. And we said we need to apply the same logic to the supply chain. So we created a prototype of a control tower supply chain, and if the production can now show, there is a short video that shows what we did. And the idea was essentially that we needed to be able, first of all, to predict the evolution of the pandemic. So we had models, we were monitoring the wastewaters, we could anticipate how many people would be hospitalized. So how much personal protective equipment do we need? How many ventilators? And then we could provide visibility along the supply chain. So we used a lot of data analytics and business intelligence to say, okay, this is what we need. The hospitals were confronted with the problem that they had to parse manually hundreds of offers from single suppliers in very far countries, with whom they had no direct relation before. So we also developed a system to filter automatically these offers and to accelerate this process dramatically. We developed a mobile application to allow the personnel in hospitals and the people working on the medical side and on the procurement and logistics side to be alerted. You will need so many FFP2 masks in 2 weeks from now, or they have just arrived, they have been delivered. And we also developed the system, what you can see there in this screen, to monitor the transport chains, because there were restrictions in airports, borders, etc. And so the combination of these things, so the insight, the prediction, the business intelligence, and the visibility this creates a mitigation approach, right? And this was something that allowed to work better in this type of situation, and that was highly appreciated by the medical personnel.
You experienced this kind of approach also to different sectors, you know, leaving aside the emergency, the COVID emergency.
Yes, we worked a few months later, so this was developed at the very beginning of the pandemic, so in 6 months between the first half of 2020 and the end of the year, we worked on these. But then there were other shocks in the supply chain, right? This is a typical phenomenon. Supply chain experts know it is what we call the bullwhip effect. So you have a small perturbation down in the supply chain, and this amplifies while you go up the supply chain, and this creates a massive problem, typically 6 to 9 months later. And so this happened in construction. Construction is a very important sector in the European economy. It represents 9% of the European GDP in 2019, which is about 1.2 billion euros. 18 million direct jobs associated to the sector in Europe, plus all the indirect impact, right? Because if you can build infrastructures or offices or homes, then you stop the rest of the economy, right? So this is a critical sector. And what we saw was, first of all, there was a shock in production of a lot of materials that are important for construction. So steel, wood, plastic, insulation materials, all these things were suddenly not produced at the same pace. And then there was a complete change on the demand side, because when the people were locked down, they started to be at home. So construction of office buildings stopped, but the people, while they were at home experiencing this new life, they all started to think, hey, maybe this is the opportunity to renovate my house, right, or to buy a larger home. And so there was a lot extra demand on the personal construction, let's say. And that's a big issue, because you have a shock on supply and you have a change in demand. And what we saw, there was an incredible delay in construction projects, and the prices were skyrocketing, because all the materials, you know, wood, steel, they were costing even 10 times more than before. And so in this case, we did a study to analyze the phenomenon and also to provide recommendations to the sector, which needs to change the approach. Because in construction, the typical way in which you do the logistics is project-based, right? Every construction project has a specific supply chain that is created ad hoc for that project, and then you do another project, you start from scratch. And this is not the case for most of the supply chains that we know. This is not optimal, and we need to change it. We need to move towards a product-based supply chain, where you have more communication between the different layers of the supply chain, and you can plan in advance, and you can prevent disruptions in a much more effective way. And then you need to change materials. You need to use a lot more wood, for instance, which is easier to source, and now you have technologies that allow for a wood-based building. And you need to go for recycling. So all these things are important to adapt and mitigate the risks.
Yeah, absolutely. Martin Blok, talking logistics. What's the role that logistics can play in making supply chain more resilient? And what did you learn in the last couple of years that were so shocking for everyone, but specifically for logistics also?
For sure we have seen, and thanks for the question, for sure we have seen several changes. As logistics, we are an enabler for all the manufacturers, the companies are here in today's situation. If I would look at what are the impact, what are the changes, for sure, yesterday was the theme, is globalization still there? We've seen a shift of production from a few companies moving out of China, moving to Vietnam, moving to Indonesia or Malaysia, so shifting their production to other countries, or moving their production, let's say, to Middle East or to Europe. The theme whether globalization is over is very clear, it's not over. So yes, there has been disruptions in the supply chain. In terms of risk mitigations, they're looking for other places to do their production, but globalization is still there. If I would look at transportation, we have seen two kinds of changes. On one hand, less on the manufacturer side, but more on, for instance, an industry like fashion and retail. There has been a huge shift from a B2B kind of distribution to a 2C, an e-commerce boom we have seen in the last 2 years. So for us, as a logistics company, of course, a big impact how we do our distribution, let's say, to the final customers. That's one change. And next to that, we have seen that several manufacturers have reviewed their transportation modes in view of the impact on sea freight, air freight, because there has been limited capacity on the air freight market. They have been looking, how do I organize, let's say, my transportation in order to get the goods into my company, into my factory. So where we are traditional shipping, lightweight shipments, we also have seen shipment which used to be on the air freight market moved to an express kind of solutions, at least in today's situation or in the past 2 years, in order to have a sustained production or to maintain the security of the production. For us, it's a big question whether this stays like this or it moves back, let's say, to air freight or sea freight. But we'll see what's going to happen in the next few years.
Okay, definitely. And Andreas Kühmichel, your customers are manufacturers. So how do you help them in responding with more flexibility, agility to the unexpected shocks as the ones that were mentioned and happened recently?
So IBM basically spent $34 billion a couple of years ago to acquire Red Hat. Mm-hmm. So you might ask yourself, what has Red Hat to do with supply chains? I will explain to you in a moment. With Red Hat, IBM and Red Hat has become one of the biggest, if not the biggest, contributor to open technologies. When you think about the requirements to a supply chain, which we see, which is resiliency and flexibility at the same time, which seems contradictory, and you think through this, you figure pretty quickly that the problem on the planet is that the supply chains are distributed globally in different deployment models and in different economies with different regulatory compliance requirements. Now, what we need to have these days with all the disruptions Francesco explained about is we have the flexibility to change quickly, to adopt quickly, to get the transparency in the supply chain on the data which you have. And the best and fastest way to do this is use open technologies. If you're confined to technology, to a proprietary technology, I don't want to say you're doomed, but you have problems to move quickly. And we see that happening in many of the industry consortia we are working on. I'll make an example. Just this week, we had a readout of Catena X work groups. It's anything on open group. We heard Gaia X, all on open technologies for a reason, right? So I think with that, we have the right technology, the right strategy with what we call hybrid multi-cloud approach. We offer our customers the ability to be ready to deploy technology wherever it's required, as opposed to impose the technology and then build a solution. So that is a very important shift we have taken. And in my perspective, in projects I see, open standards, hybrid cloud, hybrid edge, is the facilitator for using data and AI to be faster in adopting supply chains.
Yeah, that's the big critical issue, because we're still missing standards and open standards for the industry, and it's absolutely crucial for the transparency of the supply chain, where the market is going and what the regulation is preparing in that sense. What's your expectation are?
So I think it will only grow, right? I think the adaptation will happen. I just yesterday had a thought about a situation I had in 2003, by the way. I was meeting with a big strategist of a big US-American company, and he told me only 10% of what we do in IT is differentiating. 90% is basically commodity. And I had it sink in for 20 years now, and I think it's true. It's true, right? We need to think about what's differentiating, and there are a lot of pieces which are not differentiating, and we need to find a way to help our customers to be differentiating. So we develop platforms, and we're working closely with Francesco. So very nice example on digitalization of supply chains, on building the data platforms for supply chains, and logistics in production. So we have all these projects on the table. And again, anytime we go in there, we see that open standards help a lot. There's a lot of discussion at the moment in the market. We heard, I think, a little bit of that here about a product carbon footprint. It's a big challenge. It's going to come. And the question on the table is, if you have a car like we see outside, the question is, what's the product carbon footprint of this car, which comprises of 100,000 pieces? How do you do that? When pieces, parts of this car are coming from Malaysia, coming from Australia, coming from the US, coming from Germany, how do you really substantially name the carbon footprint of that product? It's going to come, everybody will be under that regulatory compliance. And how do you do that best way? Use open standards. Otherwise, you will not make it work. The experience we see with Red Hat is exactly that way. It's a challenge to do it anyhow, but without open standards, I'm a firm believer it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. So, Francesco Ferrero, what do you expect from manufacturer? Because one of the first reactions to these unexpected shocks is I have to shorten my supply chain to make it more resilient. I have to reshore a part of my suppliers, and in addition, these kind of standards, you mentioned 7 tiers, 8 tiers. So how to make it simpler? What do you expect in those terms?
So you know, when the Biden administration started to work in the United States, they gave 100 days to a task force to analyze the dependencies of essential manufacturing from foreign powers, right? And they looked into the medical supply chain. 80% of the essential components to create all the medicines that we use in Europe are made outside Europe, mainly in China and India. They looked into electric car batteries supply chains, where you know you need lithium, you need cobalt, you need things that are pretty much also outside the control of Americans and Europeans. And they looked in other supply chains like microchips, etc. And so they said this is a big issue, right? Because if something goes wrong at the world level, and this was way before the current war situation, right? If something goes wrong in the relations across continents and powers, then we might be screwed, right? And so this is where this thinking comes from. And now I think that in the current situation, we are even more aware of that risk because we have learned some lessons in the hard way now, especially for energy, etc. And that we will be pushed more and more also by politics to go in the direction of near-shoring or reshoring some of these essential supply chains. And that I fully share the recommendation we shouldn't rush through it because there's a heavy impact which can be translated also in these functionalities and costs for the end users, right? And since we also have to fight inflation, we don't want now these costs to skyrocket simply because we repatriate some things or we create inefficiencies in the supply chain. In any case, it's a process that takes more than 10 years, right, to change the supply chain of a complex product. So we need to really think how to do it well, and I think, again, technology can be a powerful helper there, because what we need is to be able to make scenarios, to simulate, if I do reshoring or nearshoring of this specific type of my supply chain, what will be the impact across the chain, where do I need to put the priorities, where do I need to put the money, how long I need to wait to measure the side effects. This is again something in which data, and so sharing of data and artificial intelligence and business intelligence can provide a lot of support.
Yeah, absolutely. And also what we hear on the market and reporting day in, day out is that companies are trying to build more control tower to get more information about their supply chain versus rushing to reshore stuff. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, but there's more talk than walk in the corporate industry. And you were mentioning that globalization is not over. What are the main signs that, because there's a lot of geopolitical risk and there's a lot of tensions, but in your numbers, in your flows of trades, what do you see in this term?
Well, once more, globalization not over, like I mentioned before, we see shift of production from one country to another. So we see the importance of markets is shifting, whether it used to be the dominance of China as an importing, let's say, country for us, moving to Europe. You see that part is shifting. So the biggest impact we see shifting of flows in our network. However, the international trade is still there. So that's what I mentioned, is globalization is over? No, globalization is not over. It's still there to say. If I make the link towards, let's say, the data part, in that perspective, there we see a lot of regulations coming up, but that's very much linked in our world to customs. So the importance of data is there. Next year there is the ITIS, the import control systems, all the shipments moving into the European community or transiting in Europe. There's also the questions coming up to have this well regulated in order to have these shipments still keeping on flowing in our network. So also for us, the data is very important to enable the shipments keep flowing in the network in order to do the deliveries in time.
You too are a very global and complex organization. How did you react to this new situation? How did you make DHL more resilient to shocks?
First of all, we are big, but I hope we're not complex, by the way. So before you have the impression we are complex. Because the good thing is, despite we are a big organization, we also are very resilient. So we are very, the biggest part of our company is an operational, let's say, modus we have as a company. So we kept on doing this during the pandemic, and of course we need to take all the regulations into place. For the ones working in offices, like all the companies, the smart working concept was also there, a theme. But we have been rather resilient, keeping on, let's say, helping, keeping on the shipments, keeping on our customers. I think the biggest advantage we have been doing towards our customers to be present for our customers. So to help, what's the current situation with the pandemic? How can we help our customers still to do their businesses? So the biggest thing we have been doing towards our customers is being present and to help them and to share what kind of change we have seen in terms of pandemic regulations, what's happening in the other countries, and how can we support our customers to do business.
Now, Andreas Kühmichel, and is it reshoring? Is it getting more information and transparency throughout the supply chain? It's a transformation. Where are the main critical areas that you can see in your manufacturing customers in this process? What's the level of maturity that on average you can feel in the customers you have?
I would like to point out two things there, right? So one is preparedness, and the other one is ecosystem. Preparedness. I'm security primus for all industries in IBM. And what I've seen in the security incidents I've worked in, I was involved in a couple of ransomware recoveries, is that you find when you do not do risk analysis beforehand, and if you're not prepared to recover, you have a really hard time to recover. There were companies who had to send home all employees for weeks long, right? Because they weren't prepared. And I would like to go away from considering digitization as a burden, but as an opportunity to be prepared. So those companies who use digitization as a means, use data and AI to be ready to find the problems quickly or even before they happen, what you can do with AI, are in a better position to overcome disruptive challenges to the supply chain, which we have seen now a couple in the past years. So digitization as an opportunity to be prepared. The other thing I think is important to understand, and we are investing in ecosystems as we speak, is a big area for us, because anything to move fast is to respect that we have an ecosystem of players, right? Everybody with each speciality. Very important, in particular in supply chains. So manage the supply chains with technology, be prepared to do this, is of the essence to be future ready and not to be reluctant to endeavor into this, but consider it as an opportunity, because what you have is basically the ability to be quicker to react, in a better position to react without destroying your business.
Ecosystem have to be safe ecosystem, and we can't predict where the next shock will come from, but it's already been said here at WMF, might be a cyber attack or kind of a cyber threat. How do you see manufacturers looking at this specific area?
Oh, that's we've seen a lot of change in the past, right? So there were a couple of manufacturers hit. We don't know all because it's something they want to keep under the covers. But what we have seen picking up really is, I mean, that the readiness to invest in doing a security risk assessment and include geopolitical threats, right? So because a lot of the threats come from geopolitical attacks driven by either countries, terrorist organizations, or espionage, industrial espionage. So what we have seen is that the interest in securing manufacturing per se and the whole data per se is increasing, right? So what I also heard here, which I think is great, it hasn't been so 10, 15 years ago, I can tell you. We did research 10, 15 years ago, but data now is accepted as being the gold standard of the underlying digital economy, right? Now, with that, everybody understands data is the intellectual and the capital which you have to do manufacturing. So that's a big change in digitalization. And what do? You want to protect the data. So make a risk assessment. And with that risk assessment, you can be better prepared, you know, how to react to these changes. With the flexibility, you're in a better position to adopt quickly.
Well, Francesco Ferrero, and now WMF has decided to dedicate this edition to supply chain and resilience because we are entering completely a new era in supply chain, from cost optimization to risk minimization, risk reduction. That's the driver of the rethinking, redesigning of supply chain. What do you make of that? And can you mention other sectors, for example? Because risks can also come from, you know, the transition towards sustainability and the way we approach also the greening of manufacturing.
Yeah, that's absolutely a central question. And by the way, it is hardly pushed now by regulation. So there's a law in Germany, which we call the Supply Chain Act. It's an impossible name for me to pronounce in German, but it's already in force. Yeah, Andreas can say that. It is already in force, and it forces all companies with more than 3,000 workers, to look into possible environmental related and human rights related violations in the first tier of their supply chain. So this is quite simple, right? Because it's only one tier and it's only for quite large organizations. It's already extremely difficult. And we work now with a major actor in the field that I can't tell you which one because of NDAs, of course, but to use artificial intelligence to look into the risks that are associated to that for German companies. But there is an analogous European regulation that will come into force very soon, which is a lot more demanding than that, because this will apply to all companies above 250 people, so a lot more companies and much smaller companies, and this will be applied to the entire supply chain. And then you need, for instance, to measure your environmental risks. And I fully join what Andreas said about the difficulty to calculate, for instance, the carbon footprint of a product. This is a demand that is also related to financial choices. You know, now there are a lot of funds that operate under ESG restrictions that are mandated to invest in companies that can guarantee and certify the respect of certain standards, including in their supply chain. Mm-hmm. And so you really need to be able to collect data from the beginning to the end of the life cycle across multiple countries, multiple standards, and this is a nightmare, right? And not only in technological terms. It's really much of the shipping today is still paper-based, as you know, and no one wants to share the data because they are considered commercially important. And so how do you solve that question is a very intriguing research problem.
Absolutely. Martin Blok, how do you handle with this? And also what Francesco was mentioning, which is how can you secure that over your supply chain, also the environmental and the social aspects are, you know, under your control?
If I start with the environmental kind of part, of course, logically we are a logistics company, so we do have our carbon footprint, let's say, in the world. I see two kind of developments on our side happening there. First of all, a big investment. We have the operation on the ground and in the air. So our last mile distribution, we're taking huge investment to change, say, the last mile distribution from the normal CO2, let's say, kind of emissions, to move to an electrification. So our objective is that at 2030, 60% of our last mile distribution is electrical. So that's the investment we make in today's situation with our last mile distribution. Next to that, the biggest theme is with our flights, because the emissions we have with the CO2 is connected to our flights. In today's situation, we have, let's say, we call it offsetting, the compensation, a Go Green program where customers can compensate for the emissions. However, meanwhile, we take a lot of investment, we call it sustainable air fuels. Sustainable air fuels, instead of offsetting, that's the concept of insetting. So to prevent, we have the emissions still, let's say, with our flights. It's not easy because, let's say, the availability of sustainable air fuels in the market is limited. So we're making huge investment. The company, Deutsche Post DHL, is making an investment of 7 billion from now to the end of 2030 in order to reduce our footprint. And with the carbon, or let's say with the flights, the objective is that 30% of our fuels is linked to sustainable air fuels in order to reduce our footprint and to maintain a sustainable operation.
Andreas?
Let me make it. I sponsored an IBM internal study for green supply chain. Of course, I mean, supply chains need to green. And there was an interesting aspect of the findings, which was sustainability is the same like resilience. So basically, you know, when you have a green, sustainable supply chain, you use less resources. You have better control, you can manage it much better, and in the end, it's more resilient. And I found it super interesting because basically by using the same techniques and technologies and processes, adapting a green concept to supply chain makes it more resilient right away. So I thought that was an interesting finding, and I think we're all looking for this, right? You know, how to reduce the consumption. Reducing the consumption is creating less waste.
All right, let's try to wrap up a bit this conversation before we move over with your final takeaway. What's your main idea or a suggestion that you can share with the audience of manufacturing companies here today? Francesco Ferrero.
That you really need to work on the visibility and transparency of your supply chain, and that technology that is already available today can be a powerful support for doing that. So you need to start investing because it takes a lot of time. It's not really hard to deploy the technology, but what is really hard is to understand all the non-technological barriers, how to ensure the privacy of data, how to share the data information without sharing too much information, who must have access to what. There is a lot of thinking and experience and discussions between multiple stakeholders and multiple regulatory systems that need to be made. So it takes time.
Should they be ready to start building kind of the control tower that we saw in your experience? Okay, maybe virtually. Martin Blok?
I would say globalization is still there, so supply chains will be globally still being organized. My suggestion, my takeaway would be twofold. Make the data part of your agenda, data risk mitigation, or to manage your data, let's say, make it part of your agenda. And next to that, sustainability, make it also part of your agenda. Not only for your own company, but also make yourself more attractive towards the market. So the things we are doing, let's say, as a company, we do it not as we feel obliged, let's say, only to the environment, but we see also our customers are interested in the investment we're doing, because also our customers are interested, they're using partners with sustainable solutions.
Andreas Kühmichel?
So I would say, you know, we all hate disruptions. We don't like the Russians invading Ukraine. We don't like COVID. But we need to consider this all as an acceleration of a process which was already ongoing before, simply an acceleration, which is driving towards digitization and considering digitization as an opportunity as opposed to a problem to help getting supply chains greener.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for this vibrant discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.